The clock is ticking for Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump isn't bluffing anymore. After months of failed diplomacy and broken promises, the White House has drawn its final line in the sand. Secondary sanctions on Russia are expected to be implemented Friday, not just targeting Moscow directly, but hitting the countries that keep Putin's war machine running by buying Russian oil. This isn't just another empty threat. This is economic warfare at its most sophisticated level, and it could reshape the global energy market overnight. For nearly 3 years, the world has watched as Ukraine bleeds while Russia profits. Every barrel of oil sold to China, India, and Turkey has funded another missile strike on Ukrainian cities, another wave of destruction that has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. But Trump's patience has run out, and his latest ultimatum represents the most aggressive economic pressure campaign against Russia since the invasion began. The story begins with a simple deadline that has sent shockwaves through global markets. Trump originally gave Putin 50 days to reach a peace deal with Ukraine, but as Russian forces continued their relentless assault, as civilian casualties mounted, and as Putin showed zero willingness to negotiate in good faith, Trump made a dramatic decision. He cut that deadline to just 10 days, setting Friday as the moment when everything changes. But what exactly are secondary sanctions, and why should Putin be terrified? Unlike traditional sanctions that target Russia directly, secondary sanctions go after the countries and companies that do business with Moscow. It's a strategy that recognizes a simple truth: Russia's economy doesn't exist in a vacuum. The Kremlin depends on willing buyers for its oil and gas, and those buyers have become complicit in funding Putin's war. The numbers tell the story of this economic lifeline. Despite facing the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history, Russia has consistently earned more than 500 million euros every single day from energy exports since the invasion began. That's over $580 million flowing into Putin's war chest daily, money that buys missiles, tanks, and ammunition used to terrorize Ukrainian civilians. China stands as Russia's most important economic partner, purchasing almost a third of all Russian exports and nearly half of its oil. India has emerged as another crucial customer, buying up almost 40% of Russia's total oil exports in 2023 alone. Turkey completes this trio of enablers, each country prioritizing cheap energy over Ukrainian lives. Trump's secondary sanctions strategy targets this entire network. The White House has made it clear that countries continuing to buy Russian oil will face severe economic penalties. We're talking about 100% tariffs on goods from these nations, turning their products prohibitively expensive in American markets. For countries like India and China, whose economies depend heavily on exports to the United States, this represents an existential threat to their economic prosperity. The first shot has already been fired. Trump announced an additional 25% tariff on goods from India, specifically targeting New Delhi's refusal to stop importing Russian oil.
Prime Minister's statement earlier today morning when he said that, there will be no compromise with the interest of Indian farmers at any cost, and he may have to pay a heavy price for it, but he will not relent in any manner. So it is making very clear that what Prime Minister Narendra Modi here is doing, is standing up against the bully. He's rallying his friends, and he's letting his actions do be the message. And, rather than take on Mr. Trump directly, there has been no phone call exchange between Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi, but Mr. Modi has come on the phone line with the Brazilian president for over an hour to discuss how both the countries are facing the worst 50% tariffs from the U.S. and how they should align their forces more. It also comes on a day, Ayushman, when Indian National Security Advisor Mr. Ajit Doval was in Moscow, and he announced that the visit of the Russian President Vladimir Putin to India is almost finalized now. So, those words should also be taken with a lot of seriousness, because while India is facing 25% extra tariff due to its ties with Russia, Mr. Ajit Doval landed in Russia yesterday, and today he has made the statement that the Russian president will soon be in India. So all this is, I think, a lot of messaging going on from India by rallying its forces and going not just Brazil, but also citing its old friendship with Russia to stand up to the Mr. Donald Trump's tactics.
Prime Minister Modi has responded with defiance, declaring that India will not compromise on its farmers' interests at any cost. The Indian leader is rallying allies, including Brazil and Russia, with Putin's visit to India being finalized as a clear signal that New Delhi won't be bullied into choosing sides. This coordinated response from emerging economies represents a direct challenge to American economic hegemony. The timing of these sanctions is no coincidence.
Right. So Steve Witkoff has gone to meet with the Russians some 5 times, and this is quite a lot of negotiation. And they rarely disclose all the details of those negotiations. I think in many ways it seems like they are keeping the negotiating table open and trying to compel Russia to evolve and move into a direction that's more favorable to what the United States is looking for. But at no point has it looked like Steve Witkoff has been able to secure any sort of tangible progress from Russia in terms of a ceasefire, in terms of even limiting the sort of strikes that the Russians and the Ukrainians have been willing to engage with each other, the Russian attacks on major population centers, or even Ukrainian attacks into Russia, albeit not major population centers. There's again, a lot of talking between Russia and the United States, and it seems that Witkoff is going out of his way to keep as many doors open to Russia to compel them to further progress. But again, so far, no tangible progress that I've seen.
Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, recently held what the president called a highly productive meeting with Putin in Moscow, marking significant progress in diplomatic efforts. For 3 hours, Witkoff pressed the Russian leader for concessions, for any sign that he was willing to end the bloodshed in Ukraine.
Not ever. I follow what Putin says closely. I follow what his aide says closely. Never once since he launched this full-scale barbaric invasion of Ukraine has he hinted that he's changed his goals. Remember, if you buy a map in Russia today, 4 of the territories of Ukraine are part of that, Crimea as well. But the Russian forces have not yet conquered those 4 regions. So I don't see any scenario under which he abandons that goal. I think he's pursuing all those goals. There's not one that's a priority and one that's not. I think he's pursuing them all, and he believes that he can achieve that objective because President Trump just wants to end the war, and he's not that concerned about the actual terms of it. Again, I hope I'm wrong. I hope there has been some preparation for this summit. I hope that there's been all kinds of secret.
Despite conducting 5 meetings with Russian officials and keeping negotiations open, Witkoff has achieved no tangible progress regarding a ceasefire, limiting strikes between Russia and Ukraine, or stopping attacks on major population centers. The meeting represented Putin's last chance to avoid the economic hammer that was about to fall. But Putin's response was predictably defiant.
President Trump sent his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, to Moscow. There was a 3-hour-long conversation, the president framing it as productive, but it's very difficult to tell if anything significant will come from this session, knowing that only 2 days from now will be the deadline for secondary sanctions on Russia over its war against Ukraine. We're going to have more with our political panel on this. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us, but let's start live at the White House. Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall has the latest on this. Tyler, what else are we learning, and when could we hear an announcement if there is one?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Well, as you mentioned, we really just heard from President Trump moments ago saying that this meeting did make progress, but we haven't really seen many tangible deliverables beyond that, and that President Trump said that he briefed our European allies on these discussions as Steve Witkoff wraps up really what's his 5th round of negotiations with Vladimir Putin in Moscow ahead of this Friday, August 8th deadline for Russia to come to the negotiating table in perhaps a more meaningful way or face further economic penalties. And we did see the White House take at least the first step in making good on that threat earlier when President Trump imposed that 25% additional tariff on India over its imports of Russian energy supplies. About 37% of Russian oil ends up getting exported to India, so they are one of those top consumers. And this was something that we had long heard from President Trump, and it appears that he has taken this step, though that additional tariff will not go into effect for another 21 days. And it appears that could really just be the first blow in this pressure campaign, Joe, because we have a headline crossing on the terminal earlier this hour. People familiar telling us that the White House is considering new sanctions on Russia's covert fleet.
The Russian leader hasn't changed any of his goals since launching the invasion, with Russian maps still showing 4 Ukrainian territories as part of Russia, despite not fully controlling them. Putin continues pursuing all objectives simultaneously, keeping Ukraine out of NATO, limiting its military, and installing a Moscow-friendly government because he believes Trump just wants to end the war, regardless of terms. The Russian leader has consistently rejected calls for a ceasefire, maintaining his impossible demands that Ukraine cede territory and renounce Western support, including NATO membership. Putin's calculation has been simple. As long as oil revenues keep flowing, Russia can sustain its war effort indefinitely. This is where Trump's strategy becomes truly dangerous for the Kremlin. By targeting Russia's customers rather than Russia itself, the secondary sanctions create a web of economic pressure that Putin cannot easily escape. Russia might be able to circumvent direct sanctions through creative accounting and alternative payment systems, but it cannot force other countries to buy its oil if those countries face severe penalties for doing so. The potential impact on Russia's economy could be catastrophic. Oil and gas exports represent the backbone of Russian state revenues, funding not just the war in Ukraine, but the entire apparatus of Putin's government. If secondary sanctions successfully reduce demand for Russian energy, the Kremlin faces a financial crisis that could threaten the regime's stability. But the strategy carries significant risks for the United States as well. China and India are not just customers for Russian oil, they are crucial trading partners for America. China remains one of the largest markets for American goods, while India represents a key strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific region. Secondary sanctions could damage these relationships at a time when the United States needs allies to counter Chinese influence and maintain stability in South Asia. The economic calculations are complex and potentially devastating for all parties involved. China and India have built their energy infrastructure around cheap Russian oil, and finding alternative suppliers in a matter of days or weeks is virtually impossible. The global oil market lacks the spare capacity to immediately replace Russian exports, meaning that successful secondary sanctions could drive energy prices sharply higher worldwide. For American consumers, this could translate into higher gasoline prices and increased costs for goods imported from countries affected by the sanctions. The Trump administration appears willing to accept these short-term costs in pursuit of its larger strategic goal, forcing Putin to end his war in Ukraine. The secondary sanctions also represent a fundamental shift in how economic warfare is conducted in the 21st century. Traditional sanctions focus on isolating target countries from the global financial system. Secondary sanctions recognize that modern economies are interconnected webs where pressure applied at one point can create effects throughout the entire system. This approach has precedent in American sanctions policy. The United States has successfully used secondary sanctions against Iran, forcing countries to choose between doing business with Tehran and maintaining access to American markets. The Iranian example demonstrates both the potential effectiveness and the complications of this strategy. But Russia presents a much larger challenge than Iran. The Russian economy is more integrated into global markets, and Russian energy exports are more difficult to replace. Countries like Germany spent decades building energy relationships with Russia, creating dependencies that cannot be easily severed. The European dimension adds another layer of complexity to Trump's strategy. While European nations have largely succeeded in reducing their dependence on Russian energy since the invasion began, they remain concerned about global energy price stability. Secondary sanctions that reduce oil supplies could create market volatility that affects European economies. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has strongly endorsed the secondary sanctions approach, recognizing that cutting off Russia's revenue streams represents the most effective way to end the war. Zelensky has repeatedly called for stronger action against countries that continue to buy Russian energy, arguing that these nations are complicit in funding the destruction of his country. The Ukrainian perspective highlights the moral dimension of the secondary sanctions debate. From Kiev's viewpoint, countries that continue buying Russian oil are directly enabling war crimes. Every purchase provides Putin with the resources needed to continue his campaign of terror against Ukrainian civilians. But the countries targeted by secondary sanctions see the situation differently.
BRICS, All the nations except for South Africa have in the last 24 hours indicated solidarity, support with Bharat against President Donald Trump's approach with Bharat. Now, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has vowed to bring up U.S. President Donald Trump's escalating tariffs at the upcoming BRICS forum, signaling a potential coordinated pushback by the emerging economies. The more President Trump tries to talk about dismantling or doing away with BRICS and chalking it down, these nations are telling Trump, you don't tell us what to do. We will perhaps consolidate, we will work together, and we will engage without you in the picture. Now, Lula da Silva has also accused Washington of adopting a quote-unquote unilateral and anti-multilateral trade approach that threatens the balance of global cooperation. The Brazilian president also plans to speak to Chinese President Xi Jinping and reach out to Prime Minister Narendra Modi as part of a broader effort to initiate a collective BRICS response to the US tariffs. Now, the only question mark so far is South Africa, but they are also expected to respond very soon. Meanwhile, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval met Russia President Vladimir Putin in Moscow on Thursday, and Ajit Doval, who arrived in Moscow on Wednesday to hold crucial talks on bilateral energy and defense ties, said earlier that President Putin will visit India later this year, and there's a confirmation that's come from Prime Minister Narendra Modi too. We'll get to that in a bit. Now, Chinese embassy spokesperson, meanwhile, in India,
China and India argue that they are simply pursuing their national economic interests and that energy purchases do not constitute endorsement of Russian actions. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have shown solidarity against Trump's approach, with Brazilian President Lula da Silva vowing to bring up U.S. tariffs at the upcoming BRICS forum. These nations are signaling coordinated pushback by emerging economies, essentially telling Trump that he doesn't dictate their foreign policy decisions. The Global South's collective strength represents 85% of world population, contributes 50% of global GDP, holds 70% of natural resources, and accounts for 40% of global trade. This consolidated bloc presents a potent combination that the U.S. cannot easily counter. The timing of Trump's deadline creates additional pressure on all parties. Friday's implementation date leaves little room for negotiation or gradual adjustment. Countries must make immediate decisions about whether to comply with American demands or face the economic consequences of continued Russian energy purchases. Market analysts are watching nervously as the deadline approaches. Oil prices have already begun fluctuating in response to uncertainty about Russian supply chains. If secondary sanctions successfully reduce demand for Russian oil, the global energy market could see significant disruption in the coming weeks. The effectiveness of Trump's strategy will ultimately depend on the willingness of Russian oil customers to prioritize access to American markets over cheap energy. For countries like India, which import significant amounts of Russian oil while also depending on American technology and investment, the choice represents a genuine dilemma. China presents the most significant challenge to Trump's approach. As Russia's most important strategic partner, China has shown little willingness to abandon Moscow despite international pressure. Chinese officials have consistently argued that their relationship with Russia is based on mutual respect and shared interests, not subordination to American demands. The secondary sanctions also test the limits of American economic power. While the United States remains the world's largest economy, China and India are increasingly important global players with their own spheres of influence. The success of secondary sanctions depends on the continued centrality of American markets and the dollar-based financial system. Putin's response to the looming sanctions deadline has been characteristically defiant. The Russian leader has shown no sign of backing down, instead doubling down on his war aims and rejecting any compromise that would preserve Ukrainian sovereignty. Putin's calculation appears to be that Russia can weather economic pressure better than Ukraine can withstand military assault. This calculation may prove fatal for the Russian economy. The combination of direct sanctions, secondary sanctions, and the ongoing costs of the war in Ukraine is creating a perfect storm for Russian finances. Military spending has consumed an increasingly large share of the Russian budget, while sanctions have limited the government's ability to access international capital markets. The human cost of this economic warfare cannot be ignored. While secondary sanctions may eventually pressure Putin to end his war, the immediate impact will be felt by ordinary Russians who have little influence over their government's policies. Economic hardship could fuel domestic opposition to Putin's regime, but it could also strengthen nationalist sentiment and support for the war effort. As Friday's deadline approaches, the world watches to see whether Trump will follow through on his threats. The president has built his reputation on unpredictable but decisive action, and backing down now would severely damage his credibility in future negotiations with adversaries. The stakes could not be higher. If secondary sanctions succeed in forcing Putin to negotiate seriously, they could represent a turning point in the Ukraine war and establish a new model for economic coercion in international relations. If they fail, they could damage American relationships with key allies while providing Putin with propaganda victories. The implementation of secondary sanctions on Friday will mark either the beginning of the end for Putin's war or the start of a new phase of global economic confrontation. Either way, the decision represents one of the most significant uses of American economic power since the Cold War, with consequences that will reshape international relations for years to come. Trump's message to Putin is clear: the days of profiting from war while hiding behind complicit customers are over. Friday will reveal whether economic pressure can succeed where diplomacy has failed, and whether the United States still possesses the power to force even the most defiant adversaries to bend to its will. The countdown has begun, and Putin's empire of oil and blood may finally be running out of time.